thank you very much for taking the poll. We're grateful for that. So it seems like there's quite a few people who haven't attended a seminar before, so Helen will take that into consideration within the presentation today. So without any further delays, I'd like to introduce you to Helen. Helen's the Director of Professional Learning here at Corwin, Australia. She has a very, very deep knowledge of visible learning, and we're very excited for her to be presenting this webinar to you today. So I'd love to hand over to Helen.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on Corwin, Australia's very first inaugural webinar. It's a real privilege every time I get to speak with educators to actually learn from you, and hopefully today you'll be able to learn from me. I will point out at the bottom of the screen we have our Twitter feed happening, so if you'd like to just tweet out anything you might hear, we'll be monitoring that in the office. I am joined by Shani Pierce and Jason Kane today, who will assist me. IT perhaps isn't one of my fortes, so it's great to see that there are a lot of people joining, from teachers to leaders to impact coaches. Maybe some of you I've met before, and department level and sector level people. So I hope that you take away some things today that are new for you, perhaps consolidate what you're already doing. In generating the event today, I've had to think about who might be new, who may have already engaged with some of the content, and how I can build that deeper. So even after today, if you want to get in touch with us about to go deeper on some things or find out some more information, 1 hour is not going to be enough on feedback in the classroom. So I just wanted to let you know that we will be covering some things in greater depth, and other things we'll just touch on, and hopefully that will meet everybody's needs. We're going to start with the first quote that you can see on your screen now, and really take about 30 seconds just to read that and think about what that actually means for you in your classroom or classrooms. I'd like you to think about that quote as we continue through this afternoon in our webinar. And as we go through the overview of today, I'd like you to think about how we can maximise the impact that we're having on our students, but more importantly, how can we move their learning forward. So we've had our welcome and introduction, and these are the sessions that we'll be going through together today. We'll be revisiting and introducing some of you to the research around visible learning, but in particular some of the research around the feedback strand. And then we'll be delving into the classroom. What does it look like, and how do we need to establish our classroom so that we can have effective feedback? We'll be looking at the role of learning intentions and success criteria, and how for both teachers and learners, these are a great framework for providing effective feedback that is just in time for students and where they need to go to next. We'll also be looking at some strategies for getting feedback from our students, and then talking about, perhaps if we have some time, some question and answer and some next steps. I've got a screenshot up here as part of the presentation, and this is an actual report and feedback to a student about their inactivity when it came to the learning in the classroom. We're going to just stop for a moment and take a poll. Our number 2 poll question is, how would you rate your knowledge and understanding of feedback? Are you a novice? Do you have some proficiency? Or are you an expert? Thank you to those people who have now put in their responses, and I can see there are some people there that have engaged with feedback and show some level of proficiency, but we still have some novices, and then we have also some experts around feedback. I'm hoping today that I'll be able to allow you to each stretch your thinking or confirm some of what you already know. But if you take a look at the feedback that was provided to Anthony, around his schooling, I'm sure none of you would be still writing comments like that. As with all of our professional learning, we start by using the research that best underpins what we do. And so for us here at Corwin, we start the work that we know around teacher clarity and research around learning intentions and success criteria. These are our learning intentions and success criteria for this webinar. To understand the research, to understand the importance of creating a climate for feedback, to understand the role of effective feedback and its connection with the learning intention success criteria, developing a greater understanding of how to use the instructional feedback model, and hopefully develop deeper understanding of how to provide feedback to students to close the gap in their learning. And at the end of the webinar, we will check in and think about what is it, how have we been successful in meeting our learning intention success criteria. It's one of the practices that actually helps the effective feedback classroom, making sure that at the middle or the end of the lesson, we're stopping to check with the students, have we met our learning intention, what are our next steps, and how will we know we've been successful. So let's start at the beginning with the research. Those of you who may not be familiar with the visible learning research, it was brought together by Professor Hattie, who you can see on your screen at the moment. In 2009, or in 2008, Professor Hattie released a part of what he was working on, his visible learning meta-analysis and synthesis. In 2009, it was published, and in education, it was the first time that research was brought together in one place to help support educators across the world in knowing what makes a difference for student learning. This second book is where I've got some references out for today's webinar also, Visible Learning for Teachers. This is where the research met the classroom, and in this text, it's a really rich text for teachers in knowing how does the research translate into the classroom. In all, the research looked at over 150 influences on student achievement outcomes and progress. Included in that were 800 meta-analyses, 50,000 studies, and 250 million students from the Western countries. And at the moment, what we're doing is Professor Hattie is constantly updating this. And in a revised edition in 2011, some extra influences and some extra research was added to the text. Within this white book, the Visible Learning Synthesis, Professor Hattie has synthesized the key findings and patterns of what makes a difference in education for learners in our classrooms, from kindergarten right through to tertiary and beyond, moving into the tertiary education. Take a moment to look at the screen, take a look at the slide on your screen. What you see here is what we call a continuum of effects that the research or the influences were divided into. What we find here, if you look at 0.40, that is the minimum growth that the research shows that needs to occur in a 12-month period of student learning. So what we aim for is actually that acceleration between 0.4 and that 1 and beyond. If you look closely, you'll see the arrow for feedback actually is higher than 0.4. It's up at that 0.75. Dylan Willem described this as almost doubling the effects of learning and growth if it's done effectively. So effective feedback in the classroom, there are elements that actually support in providing students feedback that will be effective for their learning. If we have a look on the slide on your screen now, you'll see that the influences, there are many there, and we've just got some examples as you go around that circle. Lots of things were looked at with regards to the impact it had on student achievement. If we look more closely at feedback, you'll see that there were 25 meta-analyses with over 1,300 individual studies. And within each of those studies, there were studies that existed within. So a meta-analysis is where you combine a whole group of studies and summarize or synthesize them. The next step that Professor Hattie did was then grab those meta-analyses and create a major synthesis of the work. And you'll see no matter as the research comes in, you'll notice, or he noticed, that the story doesn't change for the research. It just gets more informative. You cannot look at effective feedback without discussing formative assessment. And here I have some work from Shirley Clark in Formative Assessment in Action 2012. a Bible for myself as I worked in schools on how to implement effective feedback on the lines of these 4 pillars. We need to look at learning intentions and success criteria. And we also then need to look at what does our questioning look like. In an effective feedback classroom, you also need to build that self-assessment capability and peer assessment so that students are not only receiving feedback from teachers, but they are receiving it from each other. And that's where we talk about invisible learning, building and developing the assessment-capable learner. And here sits feedback. So before we can start building an effective feedback classroom, we need to have each of these in place. And it really is up to the teacher and the collaborative teaching planning that occurs to allow this to become embedded across a school. I like this slide because it says, teachers will often say that we give feedback, but do we know what the students actually hear? Often we have not been clear with our students that what we are saying to them is actual feedback. One of the privileges of the work that I do is being able to go into schools and ask learners, what is the quality of feedback you receive from your students, from your teachers and each other? Often the students say, what is feedback? One of the first things that we need to do is reveal for students what feedback is, what it can look like and what it can sound like. So when they hear it, they know how to act on it. One of the things that we do in Visible Learning is we actually provide tools through our Evidence into Action Day seminar and our Visible Learning into Action for Teachers seminars, tools that teachers and leaders can use within their schools to actually measure what the quality of feedback is for our learners, but also teacher to teacher and teacher to leader. Effective feedback is about closing the gap. This is where you are to the student, this is where you want to be. So that's our learning intention, this is where you want to be. Visible learning's definition for feedback relates to it being just in time, just about the student, and where it can do the most good, about their learning. If students don't receive feedback in time to use it, the feedback will not help them to progress and move forward in their learning. Let's take a moment to do our next poll question. Have you introduced peer feedback into your classroom? So I take it from the poll, we have a considerable number of people who have started to introduce or are using peer-to-peer feedback in classrooms. In Visible Learning, we talk about that's building our assessment-capable visible learner, and it's one of the components that we refer to. I think you can see the poll at the moment. It's not easy to introduce peer-to-peer feedback. As we go into session 2, we start to think about what are the strategies that most effectively will help to build our peer feedback culture, a culture of feedback within the classroom, and some of the strategies that teachers can use after today and have a go and find out what's best. It'd be good to know after today what you take and what you trial in your classroom and get some feedback from myself if you'd like to. One of the most fundamental stages you'll need to start with when incorporating feedback into the classroom, or effective feedback, is making sure that students understand that that it's okay to make mistakes, that it just might mean they haven't got there yet, and that all of us are learners and all of us will get to where we need to be, provided we are understanding and provide the effective feedback that we need. So let's think about the climate of trust. Often in classrooms, students are scared to respond to open questions provided in a whole class environment. They're scared that their peers will make fun of them. They're scared that the teacher will move on. They're scared of not knowing, or sometimes it's a case of the questions coming so fast from the teacher that actually the processing for learning doesn't occur and the student can't provide or trust that if they said something that there would be time to process it. So if we think about establishing our effective classroom ready for feedback, we need to think about feedback works best when students actually make mistakes and are willing to learn from them. If you can think about the way that you've learned most things in your life, it's probably from the first case of actually making an error and then going back, thinking about it, trialling something else, and having another go. We need to make sure that our message, both verbally and physically to our students, says that it's okay to make mistakes. And if you're going to expect them to stretch themselves, then they're going to make mistakes. And they need to know that that's a normal part of the learning process. If we think back to the research we know around teacher-student relationships and Russell Bishop's work, building a positive learning relationship with your students will support them to accept feedback as a way of communicating your high expectations. Can we think about that last point? Building positive learning relationships. When you think about the visible learning research that's been brought together, we need to think about what sits behind those numbers. And we need to think about the narrative. Building a positive learning relationship is important. The research says that students need to be able to know that they can take risks in their learning with their teacher and that will be accepted. It's okay to have a positive relationship and welfare for our students, but when we're talking about the effective feedback classroom, we're talking about teacher-student relationships to do with learning. So if we think about learning and we think about the mind frame, I develop positive relationships as part of the visible learning work, it's around students asking questions and being okay if the questions don't quite make sense. It's about having clarity from the teacher to the student about what the next steps are. And it's about learning more than teaching. In the effective feedback classroom, it's very dialogic. So you engage in a lot of dialogue, not monologue. In the effective feedback classroom, it is about conversations around feedback. So we should see teachers actually conversing with students or students in conversation with each other, because that is the sense of effective feedback. It shouldn't be one person talking, but actually a dialogue between the two. Dialogue in the classroom is essential in the effective feedback classroom, providing opportunities for students to express, discuss, and argue about their ideas while the teacher is listening and roving. So less teacher, more student dialogue. Through unpacking metacognition in the classroom discussion, students start to see for themselves what they know and how well they know something. So providing opportunities like a turn and talk in the middle of when you're doing a mini lesson or an introductory lesson is important. This is the same in whether it's a primary, an early childhood, or high school or secondary college. Students require time to sit, to think, and to talk together for them to start to actually understand the learning process and themselves as learners. Things like turn and talk, paired discussions, providing opportunities for collaborative work, but with also keeping in mind that the students need to be told and shown what it means to work collaboratively together. Feedback from either a teacher or a peer is useful, providing information that enables your teaching to be modified. So what does that look like when we're talking about the role of students and teachers in the feedback classroom? In the effective feedback classroom, the role of the student is to take ownership and be able to self and peer evaluate each other. Only by providing things like learning intentions, rubrics, and classroom continuums of progress and curriculum outcomes can students truly do that. talking partners or groups, making sure that students and that climate of trust is there so the conversations can occur. Reciprocal teaching, another high influence in the visible learning research, has actually contributes to opening up the metacognition for students to talk about their thinking. Purely, at first, it was initially studied as in relation to literacy, but it can transfer across social studies, health education, science, and social studies context if we're starting to use reciprocal teaching. Another teacher practice that will help with that process and providing feedback and frameworks for discussion are things like Socratic circles or book clubs. Being allowed to think about and articulate their ideas and opinions. One of the things you could do is actually keep a time in motion graph and actually allocate when you're hearing yourself speaking as a teacher as compared to your students talking. Think about where it's balanced. Is it balanced where we're providing time, wait time, and opportunities for students to discuss and think about their opinions, or is it more that as a teacher you are doing most of the talking? Students need to feel safe about making decisions and choices, so providing them with opportunities through effective feedback with questions like, how could you use the exemplar or the rubric to help you make changes to your work? How could you go back to what we learned last week and use that information to support your next steps? Those open questions for students, they are feedback as well at the process level. Feeling confident to question, challenge, and seek help. So what does it look like for the teacher in the effective feedback classroom? You'll need to make sure that you have planning lessons which explore and promote learning. And I'm not just talking about activities. We have to really use our knowledge and understanding of the Australian curriculum to actually think about what does sequential learning look like for my students and where are they at in their learning. It means that we need to make sure that we're very clear and explicit in sharing learning goals across physical education, across our languages that we're teaching, but having a learning goal that students not only know where they need to be, but actually providing them the next steps of how they're going to get there through effective feedback. Negotiating success criteria, having students articulate what success would look like as they move forward. Planning questions. Now this is something that we often, as teachers, forget to do in our planning. One of the things that you could start with doing is make sure that when you're planning your lessons as a collaborative team or as a professional learning team, that you start to actually think about consistent messages, quality questions that you can actually ask your students. Have them there next to you to make sure, are you taking your students from surface to deep with the questions, and are the questions moving them to their next learning steps? I mentioned before some of the different strategies which will maximise student thinking and articulation with reciprocal teaching, Socratic circles, and also the strategy that teachers can use around Think Aloud. One of the most powerful teacher strategies around Think Aloud is that you articulate out loud your thinking and learning processes as you're introducing a topic, an activity, or something for the students. So it's a part of that modelling, so they can actually hear the language that is attributed to that learning process and then start to take that on themselves. So when they're explaining what's happening for their thinking and their learning and providing feedback, they have a language to be able to do it. And the last one, who can go past, actually modelling ideas by using real-life examples. So for those of you that have started to use peer-to-peer feedback, how did you introduce that? What were the steps and strategies you went with? One of the strategies that I can say that we introduced in our school was what we call fishbowl. A fishbowl is where you work with a small group of students that you feel may be ready to start modelling for their peers. You work with them intensively through explicit teaching on what feedback looks like, and then you promote them as being the experts in the classroom. They sit in a circle, and then there's other students get in a circle around them, and you ask them to model what feedback looks like. Students are more likely to stop and engage with their learners and ask for feedback than they are teachers. Graham Nuttall's work speaks highly about this, and we talk about Graham Nuttall's work as we do our feedback seminar that we have, the one-day workshop, where we focus intensely on introducing feedback to teachers and leaders. Another way of providing feedback, introducing feedback, is actually providing them with some prompts. So if you're looking on your screen just now, if you read across the table, you'll see the 3 questions that visible learning asks itself. Where am I going, how am I going, and where to next? These are the 3 questions that we encourage teachers, peers, and students to ask themselves, and leaders of schools. Where am I going? Am I clear in my classroom what the learning intentions and the success criteria are for my students? Have I got effective classroom discussions and questions and tasks that will make them elicit evidence of their learning? And then am I providing the feedback based on the learning intentions and success criteria so they know where their next steps are? And for the students, it's making sure that you introduce to them what they understand learning intentions and success criteria are and how they impact on their learning. In that way, you can activate students as their own resources and students as learners of their own learning. Let's look at this picture here of just some prompts that one of the schools that I've been working with has started to use. In order to provide a feedback language to students, we need to provide them with some stems in the initial stages. So you could start with something as simple as this, some colour-coded questions or prompts for students that they can have in front of them that will help them do their peer-to-peer feedback. You could also provide them with a rubric if you've developed a really good rubric which shows progress across and how students can sit with a work sample and together talk about the rubric. Classroom discussion is at 0.82 effect size. When learners have something like learning intentions or rubrics, enable to encourage them to have engaging conversations. You'll note that you've probably seen some of the Learning Visibly symposiums advertised coming up on the science of how we learn, so going deeper around the learning processes. Metacognition is one of those strategies that needs to be done at the surface level as well as the deep. I'm going to take a moment here and do our next poll question. Which response below is accurately describes the levels of the instructional feedback model? I'll tell you, the first one, A, probably not the one that I would put down. One of the ways I'm getting feedback is, as we do these polls, is from you guys, is knowing where to start entering in at each session. So from those of you that were able to access the poll, most of you had that the instructional level, and you can look at this now, is C. The instructional model that has been developed by Helen Timperley and Professor Hattie talks about feedback at 3 levels: task, process, and self-regulation. Now, these are the materials that Jason was talking about when we started today, and we will make sure that that download is available. On our Foundation Day, we introduce people and participants to the effective feedback model. In our Evidence into Action days, we also go back and revisit it, but then we talk about the ways that we can actually collect that information around the quality of feedback. But let's have a look at what Dylan Williams says on embedded formative assessment on page 46. So let's think about that quote and think about how this instructional feedback model actually fits. For those of you that are new to the feedback model, I'll take you through very briefly now what that looks like. The supporting materials will go out to you and you'll be able to read it a little more finely. But Jason's just looked at me and said, I'm taking too long, so I need to hurry up. So my apologies. So at the task level, we're thinking about the very first time it's new materials that students have been introduced to. So it's how well has a task been performed? Is it correct or incorrect? And the research would show us that most of the feedback in classrooms has been at the task level feedback. Very instructional, there are 8 questions wrong, can you go back and correct all of those 8 there? Where the teacher is taking most of the control of the feedback. At that next level, process level, this is where there's been some proficiency, where the student or the learner has engaged in a few experiences or learning opportunities to start to master the task. It's at that cognitive level where they're starting to use different skills and strategies. So you might think about that one is where you've sort of introduced the way to engage with a written text with a student and think about what are some of the strategies that you could use if this one doesn't work. At the process level, you're kind of letting that gradual release. So I think about the model as being task is I, the teacher, process is we. Together, we're going to think about what you can do and what it might look like, and self-regulation is you. And that's where you start to think about with the student that has a high degree of proficiency that says, that's a high degree of proficiency where you're now saying to the student, tell me about how you solved that problem. How did you know that you needed to self-correct? How could you take what you've learned and transfer it to another context? That self-regulatory student is the one that actually starts to take that ownership of their learning in what we call a assessment-capable visible learner. Oops. Oh. One of the things about effective feedback, though, is that you really need to know when do I use task, when do I use process, and when do I use self-regulation. And it's not a linear model. What you need to think about is where is the learner at before you approach them with the effective feedback. One of our self-regulated learners can sometimes quickly need a task-level feedback instruction to get them back on track. Sometimes the student at task can actually jump above because of the feedback that's been provided. So it really depends on how the teacher knows their students. As Gregory Yates says, learners need different types of feedback depending on their current skill level or where they are in their learning. So think about, when you're going to provide that process or self-regulation, does the learner have sufficient knowledge and confidence before I move them on? You can actually check how effective your feedback has been depending on whether the student puts it into practice and how they put it into practice. If they go off and 3 minutes later you come back and they're still unsure, you need to take and adjust your feedback and provide them perhaps the process level or task level, and then move them on so that they can keep moving forward. Here are some examples, and these are just ones that are from a couple of different varieties to see the instructional model in action. So if we think about the task level, can you go back and place a full stop at the end of the sentence, Michael? Very much corrective and task and instructional level. At the process level, when we were writing sentences last time, Michael, what did you need to remember to do? So there's been some mastery or some proficiency. You've written sentences several times throughout the course of the week, and you're going back, and you want Michael to take some of that ownership. Or can you go back to the last time we wrote the sentences, Michael, and look at what may be missing? Still, that's taking the student from the task initially level feedback into the process to see if they could locate and identify what might be missing. At self-regulation, Michael, can you tell me why you self-corrected your work here, or how you knew to self-correct your work? Michael, are you able to help Sally with writing her sentences, please? A self-regulatory learner is able to articulate their understanding to another student, and it shows the depth at which they understand what is being taught and learned themselves. Let's think about that role of learning intentions and success criteria. Shani is going to pop up another poll question just here for you. I'm thinking about how would you rate your level of knowledge and understanding of learning intentions and success criteria? Give you about a minute or two to do that. Okay, let's have a look at our polling response, because if we have mostly proficient or self-regulated learners at learning intention success criteria, we'll quickly jump into the next slide. So as I can see, we have some people that have some proficiency in writing or around their knowledge and understanding of writing effective learning intention success criteria. One of the best resources that I used when implementing learning intentions and success criteria across the schools that I've worked in is Shirley Clark's formative assessment work. And I think I mentioned her earlier, but she talks about making sure that all our learning intention success criteria are not those that result in just a product checklist. So we have to make sure that we're thinking about what is the conceptual understanding, what is the skill understanding and success going to look like. Learning intentions and success criteria in themselves are a whole school's journey. At least 18 months of starting to work through multiple ways of writing learning intentions and success criteria and then engaging students to that co-construction. The research you're seeing on the screen was collected by Professor Hattie, and teacher clarity sits at number 9 out of the 150 plus influences. Learning intentions and success criteria are a key to the research, and also, as I mentioned, Shirley Clark and Dylan Willem supports this research. So if we can be clear on what our intentions are for learning, students are best placed to know where they're going. They have success criteria for where they're going to next and how that they can get there. And this is what we call our student expectations, or assessment-capable learners. If you look at the diagram on the screen, this comes from our building assessment-capable and visible learner workshop. And what we're focusing on here is only one of the 4 components of the visible learner. Effective feedback classroom helps to build a core part of the visible learner that takes responsibility for their learning and takes ownership. So if you can see there, it says a visible learner seeks, receives, acts on and gives feedback. And we can only do that if we have a classroom where they can hear what effective feedback looks like, as modelled by ourselves as teachers, as long as we're understanding what it looks and sounds like. I'd like to take a moment to stop for you to read what's on the screen, because we're going to actually start to put some of this in practice. And I'm going to let you think about how might you use that instructional model and the learning intentions and success criteria to respond to students who are working through. So read the learning intention and the success criteria, and then we'll come back and look at how would we craft the feedback that sits behind this. One of the things I'd like to point out on the screen is that Shirley Clark talks about putting the context for the learning in brackets. So you'll notice there I've put in the movie The Matrix in brackets, because as we slowly work with students, we talk about our lifelong learning intention. So you could replace that context for the learning into a book you may be studying, another movie that the students may have seen. So we talk about writing learning intentions not being a product. It means that it's not the context. You have a context that is in the brackets, so the students know that the learning is about the role of costume and makeup. The context of the learning is the movie The Matrix. So if we have a look at what it might look like at the task level feedback using our learning intention success criteria, have a look here. We start with the learning intention with the student, saying in your response, the learning intention was to show that you understood the role of costume and makeup in the film The Matrix. We have that as cues, both as teachers and students. We know where the learning needs to start. You have described clearly the way costume has been used to show the distinction between the good characters and the bad characters. So we're identifying how the students are doing in their learning, and then at a task level, what might the feedback sound like for their next steps? If we went back to the success criteria, we could say you need to also describe the effect that the costume and makeup has on the audience and provide examples. Very clearly, that's the teacher giving some task level feedback. If you'd like to have a go, you could use the chat function on the webinar to actually put in what you think it might sound like to have the feedback. Again, we have the same example here, and you might like to look at, there's the learning intention. Now I've taken away some of the scaffold. What might be the feedback that or how is the student doing? And this is what the process feedback might look like as well. Can you now go back to the success criteria and see what else you may need to include? So rather than the teacher merely telling them at the task level, we put that ownership or some responsibility back onto the student. Our feedback day provides a lot of opportunity to practice using the instructional feedback model and learning intentions and success criteria for any of you interested in attending the whole day workshop. But if we're thinking about self-regulation, this is where the learner has actually had some ongoing work around ongoing learning and has written a response to a text previously. So we're expecting them to have some sort of mastery around the concept of writing a response. You can see there the learning intention again is the way that we start the conversation with the learner. We've described how they're going, and then we're looking at their next steps. How did the success criteria help you? What might you do next? That's where we start to see just 2 questions of the conversation and listen to the student and record, where they might provide some extra evidence. But you also might be able to say, now how can you transfer this to the book Jane Eyre, if that was the case? You can see here I've just provided another example of if we were looking at clarifying meaning, whether it's in a science lesson, whether it's in an English lesson, whether it's in a maths vocabulary session. Clarifying meaning is an important strategy for learners, especially when we're talking about going from surface to deep learning. So if we had our learning intention was to clarify meaning, you could put any context in brackets that you may like. But these are some of the success criteria that you may include for students so they know how successful they're being in clarifying their meaning. At the task level, you might talk to Rose about the word that she got stuck on and talk about, actually direct her to the strategy she could use to help clarify. So a picture. So whether it's a science article that she may be reading, you may want to pick out a diagram and say, does the diagram help you? After a few lessons on how to clarify meaning at either the word or the sentence level, you might move on to the process, thinking about where Rose was last time you spoke to her. And your feedback might sound something like this. To help you clarify, Rose, rereading the text didn't quite help you. What are some of the other strategies you could use to help you? Again, you're moving from that I, the teacher, to we, we're together. To self-regulation, where you're talking to Rose after you may have listened to her read or bring up some work, you might have the conversation of, can you tell me how you knew to self-correct when you were reading that part of the text? Effective feedback in the classroom also goes across classrooms and content levels, and everyone needs to have an idea of what effective feedback looks and sounds like across the school. So even in physical education, where we're learning to throw an overarm, you still need to have the skill to provide effective feedback to the student so that they can correct or make some changes or get better at how they're throwing. So you can see here, at a task level, you might be doing those basic things when you're introducing ball skills to students. You may be as basic as put your left leg in front of your right leg. I wonder, though, if we think about the start of the session, do your students actually know that this is also feedback? Not about critiquing or criticising, but actual feedback. By having the success criteria there and visible, students know that that's what you're giving them feedback on, that it is about how they will be successful and not a criticism or critique. We think about the process level. You've placed your body correctly. Can you talk through the next steps of the action? And then next, we have, can you work with somebody else on their overarm throw? You can also see that I've used Jason and Shani's name because they're helping me today in our examples. But really, as you sit and think about the types of feedback that we've gone through, have we started from the beginning and told our students what feedback looks and sounds like and the ways in which it can help them? It's important that what we model as teachers to our students, we model so that students and peers can self-assess and peer assess. As I mentioned earlier, one of the pillars of formative assessment is students being able to both peer assess and self-assess. By providing students with rubrics, with exemplars, with learning intentions and success criteria, they are able to self-assess along the way of their learning. They're able to provide feedback to each other. Tomorrow, if you went into your classroom and asked your students, what would you do if you didn't know what to do? How would they answer you? Would they say, I asked the teacher? Would they say that they asked a peer? What strategies have we provided them to self-assess and peer assess and get that immediate feedback? The teacher is possibly the last person that we need students to be going to. We need to provide them with the things we've been talking about today in the effective feedback classroom. We need to provide them with the clear learning intention success criteria. We need to provide them with work examples of what success looks like. And we need to be able to provide them with rubrics or continuums and examples of what it looks like at each stage so that students can start to navigate their learning and actually self-assess themselves prior to coming to talk to you and getting those next steps of feedback. I'd like to stop and do our next poll question. If we have a look on the screen as it comes up, how regularly do you seek feedback from your students? Okay, as we wait for the polling to come up. Okay, so some of you are seeking feedback every lesson or weekly, and a few at the end of the term. When I'm talking about strategies for getting feedback from students, we think about, and you can see the results up there, you need to think about, are we getting feedback about our teaching, or are we getting feedback about a unit of work or materials or resources for a project? Assessment as feedback to me is a critical reflection or mind frame that we talk about in visible learning and talk about across each of the seminars and workshops that we deliver. It really is about the way teachers receive feedback from their students about their learning that actually helps to improve the quality of ourselves as teachers, to critically reflect when we look at our teaching and assessments and think about formative strategies. A lot of the information you can find around getting feedback from students is quite easily things that you can start to implement in every lesson. If you think about the time that we allow for planned reflection in our lessons, we always seem to rush out and say, oh, we need to pack up quickly because morning tea's coming, or recess. In actual fact, the research suggests in an effective feedback classroom is that by cutting the learning experience shorter and committing time to reflection, students will be able to deepen their thinking and understand what has happened and occurred in the learning and be able to make some of those decisions and choices about what their next steps are. The opportunity to talk and discuss to somebody else in the classroom about what they learnt in that lesson actually deepens their understanding as well. So let's think about what's worth cutting in the classroom so that we can make sure that effective feedback is really upfront and maintained. If we think about encouraging students to provide feedback, simple things like those on your screen are tools that we can start using straight away. So we've got the 5 to 5. You can do this in the middle of a lesson. Just quickly check in with your students. Tell me how are you feeling about the concepts? Who's ready to move on? Who'd like some further help? And just simply by hand. Some of you may be using coloured cups already on tables and getting that feedback back from your peers. I was in early childhood classrooms last week, interstate, as I was working, and I saw all of these early childhood children just with coloured counters where they were able to just pick which colour, so red if they required some assistance, amber that they were challenged but didn't quite need help yet, and green to say we're okay. And the funny thing was, those buttons were to indicate to their peers the assistance they may need, not just the teacher. The last one, post-it notes. Revolutionised education for teachers. I'm a collector, but easily something we can just put up straight away so students, as they're leaving the classroom, or during reflection time, just quickly give you some data that says they got it, they're struggling, they're stuck. That quick data collection allows you to actually start to change or make modifications to what you might do next, or who you might talk to and get feedback around the lesson about what's just taken place. Other ways are using these types of things that you can see now on your screen. Some of the most recent apps that you can look at as well for gathering feedback immediately as a teacher to you is Answer Garden and Padlet. Simple downloads that you can have up straight away in your classroom that can capture students' feedback. What they both do is actually identify some key patterns and words straight away in big, bold sizes and colours, and then you're able to straight away stop, look at that feedback and maybe adjust your session. So you might want to trial those, Answer Garden and Padlet. So let's think about, and I've just been told we have about 3 minutes to go, and I know that I've gone surface, deep, deep surface, hopefully for some of you. I haven't gone too much into that last instructional level, or really the one that sits outside the instructional level, and that's praise. If the purpose of feedback is to close the instructional gap, feedback in the form of praise does not do this. If praise and instructional feedback are given at the same time, the student will be distracted away from the instructional feedback and comments given will be ignored. So Carol Dweck's done a lot of work around the growth mindset and how we can sort of move away from providing praise about the person and the individual, so well done, good job, you're so smart, how intelligent are you, moving towards providing praise related to the motivation and effort that students have put in. But even yet, modelling the language like some of that's on the screen, where students might be thinking, I'm not good at maths. Instead, this may take some time and effort. Or, I can't make this any better. I can always improve. I'll keep trying. In an effective feedback classroom, that growth mindset to learning is really important for both teacher and student. So we want to think about effective feedback and praise being like water and oil. Together, they won't close the gap in the learning for your students. So try and keep them separate when you're talking about moving the students' learning forward for them. Just have a couple of takeaways to think about for the end of the session. The hour's gone so quickly. I apologise that it's been difficult to get questions and answers and stop for that sort of interaction, but hopefully this won't be the only webinar that we do. If you think about effective feedback and the effective feedback classroom, written tasks alongside oral questioning when you're giving feedback should encourage learners to develop and show understanding of what they've learnt. So provide some evidence. Feedback should identify what has been done well and what still needs improvement, and should give some guidance on that as you're setting your learning goals with students. Feedback should cause the thinking to take place. If students don't know once they've completed something what they need to do next, then the feedback that has been given has not allowed them to cause thinking for what they could do next. Be clear about what you want your students to achieve through those learning intentions and success criteria. Think about, as a teacher in the effective feedback classroom, how much feedback can you give to your students at one time? I know one of the funniest situations as I was teaching and doing some writing feedback, I had put up my learning intentions to say talking about the descriptiveness of developing a character, and my success criteria was around those sorts of concepts. Yet my feedback to the student was confusing because I provided feedback on grammar, punctuation, text structure, all the other things that weren't actually a part of my learning intention and success criteria. No wonder the student wasn't sure what to put in place. I had set the learning up to be looking at one aspect and actually provided feedback on a whole heap of other things. When you're giving effective feedback in the classroom, remember what it was that you wanted the students to learn, and the indicators of how they would be successful, and then provide feedback around that. Keep those other things for those targeted small group teaching opportunities where you can provide some of that feedback. Communicate high expectation for your learners, and make sure that you always are thinking to them, there's a difference between not knowing and not knowing yet. Learn from students' reactions to your feedback. They walk away with a quizzical face. Perhaps your effective feedback wasn't clear, perhaps it wasn't targeted. Check in on your students or listen as they go back to activate the feedback and think and listen in for whether they heard what you said. Remember the slide from earlier? We often give feedback, but how do we know what's been heard? And discuss feedback with students, and discuss your feedback with the students. I think that's all we have time for. Are there any questions, Jason, that I can answer before we finish around the session that came out, or that we can get to later?
We'll be compiling the list of Q&A and answering directly to the participants. Following a few audio difficulties early on, and some people not being able to access the event materials, we'll definitely be sharing those later in the week. Be sure to visit the website and opt in for email so that we can share those with you. That attachment, or that PDF attachment, will be what does feedback look like at each level. And thank you very much for attending. We will be supplying a link to the recording as well in that email. And you can also visit corwinaustralia.com.au to access that recording also. So on behalf of our team here at Corwin Australia, I'd really like to thank Helen for giving up her time to provide this webinar, this complimentary webinar, and we really hope that you enjoyed it, and we look forward to you joining us again when the next one takes place.
Can I just thank those that were listening and contributing to today's polls? You understand, as we started before, that I said we had a continuum of people joining us this afternoon, so we had to I had to think about how to modify or how to adjust as we went along. There's a lot more than 1 hour when you're thinking about how does effective feedback look, but hopefully you took away just some key takeaways that you may start and implement tomorrow, and we will follow up on any of those questions that came through. So let's think about how we can make our webinar a question and answer next time, because it's really great to have some interaction from you as an audience. Thank you very much for your time.